It begins on the outskirts of a small Missouri town in the summer of 1892. The air is heavy with the heat of July, the sun sinking low over endless fields of corn and wheat. To the travelers passing through, it is a picture of quiet rural life, where families gather on front porches in the evening, where church bells mark the rhythm of the week, and where doors are often left unlocked without worry. Yet beneath this peaceful surface a storm was forming, a storm in the shape of two brothers, William and Charles Caldwell, whose names would forever stain the history of the region with terror. The Caldwell brothers were not the type to blend in quietly with their neighbors. Born to a struggling farming family, their childhood had been marked by scarcity and a father known for his unforgiving discipline. Neighbors recalled William, the elder brother, as a boy who rarely smiled and carried himself with an unsettling confidence. Charles, younger by 3 years, was quieter in demeanor, but always lingered in William's shadow, following him with a loyalty that bordered on obsession. From an early age, the two had found a strange strength in their bond, and over time, that strength would twist into something dangerous. By the time they reached adulthood, their reputations were already tarnished. Livestock thefts, drunken brawls at taverns, and whispered accusations of intimidation all trailed behind them. Most locals saw them as troublemakers, but few imagined the darkness that lay ahead. For in 1892, the Caldwell brothers would turn from petty criminals into predators, and the fields of Missouri would become hunting grounds for their cruel desires. The first hints of their true nature appeared in early May. A merchant, passing through town, vanished after stopping to rest on the roadside. His horse was found days later, grazing freely, but the man himself was gone without a trace. At first, suspicion fell on bandits, or perhaps a drifter unlucky enough to cross his path. But something about the disappearance unsettled the community. People began to lock their doors at night. Farmers began keeping rifles closer at hand. The ease of rural trust was slowly being replaced with cautious glances and whispered rumors. The Caldwells, however, seemed strangely unaffected by the fear that was creeping through the town. On the contrary, William was often seen smirking in the tavern, buying drinks with more money than anyone believed he could honestly earn. Charles sat beside him, quiet as always, but with eyes that darted nervously to anyone watching them too closely. When confronted about their sudden abundance, William dismissed it with a wave of his hand, boasting of lucky wages or jobs done out west. Yet some men in town quietly began to wonder if there was more to those explanations than met the eye. As spring turned to summer, more travelers vanished along the country roads. A peddler, a farmhand seeking work, even a family moving westward in a covered wagon. Gone, as if the earth itself had swallowed them. Fear spread faster than the summer heat. The sheriff, a weary man named Thomas Wilkins, began organizing searches, but always came back with nothing more than scraps of abandoned belongings, a shoe in the dirt, a cracked pocket watch, a blood-stained cloth buried among weeds. The sense of safety the town once carried was shattered, replaced with suspicion. Neighbors eyed each other with mistrust, uncertain who among them could be responsible. All the while, whispers grew louder around the Caldwell brothers. Stories circulated that people had seen them in strange places at odd hours, lingering near crossroads, hauling heavy sacks in the dead of night. Some even spoke of screams carried on the wind near the woods behind their farmstead. Yet in a community wary of direct confrontation, few dared accuse them openly. William had a reputation for violence, and Charles was never far behind. Most people preferred to keep their distance rather than risk provoking their wrath, but the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The brothers were hunting, and Missouri was their territory. One evening in June, an incident cast the first undeniable shadow of suspicion. A group of travelers making their way west stopped in town for supplies. Among them was a young woman, no older than 20, who caught the unwanted attention of William Caldwell. Several townsfolk recalled how he watched her with a predatory gaze, making crude remarks under his breath. That night, as the family prepared to camp outside town, their wagon was found ransacked, its contents spilled across the dirt. The young woman was missing. Her father claimed he had seen 2 men on horseback, following them at a distance earlier in the day, but by the time the sheriff searched the area, the trail had gone cold. From that moment, unease settled like a weight over the town. Mothers pulled their children closer, and wives begged their husbands not to travel after dark. And still, William and Charles carried on with the same grim confidence, as though they were untouchable. What made the Caldwell brothers so terrifying was not only their cruelty, but the way they worked together. William, commanding and ruthless, made decisions with cold precision, while Charles carried them out with brutal efficiency. Where one faltered, the other filled the gap. Their partnership was seamless, a synchronization built from years of brotherhood, twisted now into a weapon of violence. The people of Missouri began to realize that facing one Caldwell meant facing them both, and that was a battle few had the courage to fight. By July, the tally of the missing was growing too large to brush aside. Sheriff Wilkins, under pressure from frightened townsfolk, attempted to question the brothers directly. He visited their farm one scorching afternoon, greeted by the barking of half-starved dogs and the stench of unwashed hay. William met him on the porch, shirt sleeves rolled up, while Charles lingered silently in the doorway. The sheriff asked about their whereabouts on nights when certain disappearances had occurred, but William brushed off the questions with feigned amusement, as though the accusations were beneath consideration. Charles remained silent, his gaze fixed to the ground. With no solid evidence, Wilkins had no choice but to leave, though his unease only deepened. That was the turning point. From that day on, the Caldwell brothers seemed to grow bolder, their hunts more frequent, more brazen. Missouri was no longer a place of simple fears. It was a place haunted by predators who walked in plain sight, predators bound by blood and sharpened by cruelty. And soon, their crimes would escalate into horrors that no community could ignore. As the summer of 1892 wore on, the Caldwell brothers' shadow stretched wider across Missouri. Fear was no longer confined to the town. They had become a whispered menace along the back roads, a curse muttered by travelers who prayed they would pass through unnoticed. Yet for those who lived close to the Caldwell farm, the signs had been building for months. They had become unwillingly the silent witnesses to a growing horror. Neighbors who ventured near their land reported strange sights. William and Charles were often seen digging late into the night, their lanterns casting eerie glows across the fields. Sometimes the sound of hammering broke the silence, and other times it was the barking of their half-starved dogs that carried through the still air, as though the animals sensed something more sinister, buried beneath the soil. But Missouri was not a place where families easily confronted one another. Out here, isolation was a way of life, and secrets could stay buried for years. Still, some carried suspicions too heavy to ignore. One neighbor, a widow named Margaret Price, told friends she was certain she had heard screams one evening after sundown, carried on the wind across the cornfields. She kept it to herself at first, afraid of retaliation, but her unease grew unbearable. The only thing she dared to do was warn her teenage son never to wander near the Caldwell property. Her fears, though unspoken publicly, were not unique. By midsummer, many households whispered of strange noises, of strangers seen heading toward the Caldwell land and never returning. What few realized at the time was how meticulously the brothers planned their hunts. William understood the psychology of fear. He knew the best way to keep suspicion at bay was to move in shadows, to strike travelers, outsiders who had no family nearby, no roots in the community to search for them when they vanished. Charles followed his lead, his loyalty blinding him to the grotesque gravity of what they were doing. Together, their precision made them almost invisible to the law. Almost. Sheriff Wilkins, though short on evidence, was not entirely blind. He sensed patterns the townsfolk could not. The disappearances aligned with routes that passed near the Caldwell farm. The spacing between crimes suggested the hand of careful planning, not chance. And each time he looked William Caldwell in the eyes, he saw no trace of remorse, only cold superiority, as though the law itself were powerless against him. But patterns alone could not secure arrests. In 1892, without witnesses, evidence, or confessions, the law had its limits, and the brothers knew that. It was in mid-July when the case reached a breaking point. A farmer named Elias Turner was found dead in a ditch just 2 miles from town. Unlike the other disappearances, his body was not hidden. His throat had been cut, his belongings stripped away. But it was the brutality of the act that shocked the town. This murder was not the work of common robbers. It was rage, it was domination, and it was close enough to home that people could no longer dismiss the threat as an unfortunate curse upon strangers. Whispers immediately circled back to the Caldwells. Elias had last been seen leaving the tavern, where he argued with William Caldwell over a debt. Several men remembered William storming out after Elias, his voice low and threatening. Days later, Elias's corpse was discovered. The coincidence was too sharp to ignore. Yet once again no one had seen the act itself, and the Caldwells remained untouchable. Sheriff Wilkins questioned them harshly, but William claimed he had been at home the entire night, supported by his brother's word. Charles, loyal as ever, reinforced the alibi with quiet conviction. Without proof, the sheriff's hands were tied. This death, however, sparked something new in the community. Fear turned into anger. Men began openly discussing the brothers in hushed groups at the tavern. Some pushed for vigilantism, arguing that justice could not wait for courts or sheriffs. Others warned against crossing William Caldwell. Stories of his violent temper kept their rage at bay. The town was caught in a fragile balance, trapped between fear of predators and fear of retaliation. Meanwhile, William thrived in the atmosphere of dread he had cultivated. He moved through the town with unshaken confidence, his eyes daring anyone to accuse him outright. Charles followed closely, his presence quieter but equally imposing. Their dominance over the community was not just physical, it was psychological. Each glance, each whispered rumor reinforced their control. By now the Caldwells believed they could act without consequence. And for a time they were right. Late in July, another family disappeared along the back roads, a husband, wife, and their young son. Their wagon was found abandoned near the woods, their horses untied but unharmed. Inside the wagon, signs of struggle were evident. Blood on the wooden boards, a torn bonnet, a child's toy left in the dirt. The cruelty was undeniable, but the absence of bodies left the town questioning what fate had befallen them. People began whispering of burial grounds, of shallow graves scattered through the Missouri fields. Margaret Price's story of nighttime screams no longer seemed like paranoia. The silent witnesses were beginning to understand what was happening, but they still lacked the courage to face it. By August, Missouri was drowning in unease. Travelers avoided the area, fearing the roads that threaded past the Caldwell homestead. Families began locking their doors at sundown, a habit once considered unnecessary in the friendly countryside. Men armed themselves even for simple errands, rifles slung over shoulders as a warning to the unseen predators in their midst. Everyday life carried the weight of expectation, an understanding that the next victim might already be chosen, and yet, even in this climate of fear, the brothers lived as they pleased. Their farm became a fortress of secrecy, a place people passed with downcast eyes, never daring to linger. Rumors suggested more than one person had stumbled too close and disappeared. Still, without proof, the town remained frozen, caught between suspicion and paralysis. Sheriff Wilkins, exhausted and desperate, swore to find evidence that would finally break the cycle. But William's arrogance and Charles's silence shielded them like armor. For the moment they remained predators in plain sight, but shadows, no matter how deep, cannot hold forever. The Caldwell brothers had grown too bold, too careless, and as August rolled into September, their trail of violence would at last begin to unravel, dragging Missouri into the darkest chapter of its history. By early September of 1892, Missouri could no longer deny that something monstrous was brewing in its farmlands. The Caldwell brothers had cultivated fear as if it were another crop in their soil, spreading unease with every disappearance they left behind. Yet as much as they tried to bury their sins, both literally and figuratively, small cracks began to appear in the silence that had protected them for so long. The first crack came from those left behind. Families of the vanished became louder in their demands for answers. Wives wept at church altars, fathers clenched their fists in frustration, and neighbors, once content to whisper within the safety of their homes, began to ask sharper, riskier questions in public. In a place where community had always been its greatest strength, the Caldwells were beginning to isolate themselves. Fear, once their weapon, was turning into suspicion. Sheriff Wilkins felt this shift acutely. Each time he walked down the dusty main street of town, he was confronted with pleading eyes and voices demanding justice. His inability to produce arrests weighed on him, his authority thinning like worn rope. But Wilkins was not a man content to surrender, and though evidence against the Caldwells was scarce, he had begun moving quietly, setting his own watch on their farm, testing whether patience could reveal what direct confrontation could not. What he didn't know was that others were watching too. The brothers' behavior was becoming harder to conceal. A hired hand who worked occasionally near the Caldwell property told the local preacher that he had seen William and Charles dragging a heavy sack into the woods one night. It looked, he swore, too heavy for grain and too misshapen for tools. When asked why he didn't report it sooner, the young man admitted he feared ending up like those who had vanished. His warning was passed along cautiously, but it added weight to Wilkins's growing suspicions. Meanwhile, William's arrogance was beginning to slip into recklessness. At the tavern, he spoke louder, drank harder, and made less effort to mask the sneering pride he carried. To those who dared listen, his words hinted at things best left unspoken, phrases about teaching people their place and taking what's ours. Some swore they heard him laugh about the missing families, though whether those were drunken exaggerations or dangerous truths was impossible to know. Charles, as always, remained quieter, but even he began to show cracks in his composure. His eyes carried a heaviness, and when spoken to, he often struggled to maintain steady words. Then came the night that rumors turned to something far too real. It began like any other restless evening in the town. Men had gathered at the tavern, their conversations subdued, their laughter muted under the oppressive shadow of the disappearances. Near closing, a stranger wandered in, a traveling salesman whose wagon had been seen earlier in the day on the outskirts of town. He ordered a drink, spoke lightly with those inside, and then departed into the night, planning to camp along the road before resuming his journey west. He was never seen again. What made this disappearance different, however, was what was left behind. His overturned wagon was discovered at dawn, only a few miles out of town. Scattered goods covered the road, the remnants of a violent struggle obvious even to untrained eyes. And this time tracks were visible, boot prints pressed deep into the soil, 2 sets leading away from the wreckage. They were not the marks of highway bandits attacking by chance. They were purposeful, deliberate. And those who had lived long enough in Missouri knew whose boots were likely behind them. For Sheriff Wilkins, this was the final straw. Though not yet enough for a conviction, it was enough to act. He organized a small group of deputies and instructed them to keep the Caldwell brothers under discreet but constant surveillance. By day they appeared to farm their land. By night, however, their movements grew erratic. Lanterns flickered in their fields long after midnight. Wagon wheels creaked over dirt paths in hours when no honest farmer would work, and their dogs barked endlessly at unseen intrusions. The more Wilkins saw, the firmer his resolve became. The Caldwells were not just suspicious. They were predators hiding in plain sight, but even predators can become careless when they believe themselves invincible. It was during this period of covert investigation that the final cracks in their silence began to widen. A group of hunters, traveling through the woods one morning, stumbled upon a shallow grave. Inside lay the decomposed remains of 2 adults, along with fragments of clothing that matched descriptions of a missing couple. The discovery sent a wave of fury and fear crashing through the community. There was no longer doubt that murder stalked the countryside. It was now undeniable fact. Although no proof directly tied the graves to the Caldwells, every whisper pointed in their direction. They lived closest to the area. They had been seen moving in those woods at night. And most damning of all, the burial site was less than a mile from their farmstead. The town grew restless, edging closer to reckoning. At church meetings, voices rose in anger, demanding that something be done. Farmers gathered in 2s and 3s, debating whether to take the law into their own hands, before more lives were lost. The Caldwells, sensing the rising threat, withdrew further into isolation. Their farm became almost abandoned to outside eyes, its boundaries guarded not by fences, but by the tense silence of neighbors too frightened to cross them. But beneath that silence, tensions were reaching a breaking point. William's arrogance was one step away from catastrophe. Charles's loyalty was fraying under the weight of what they had done, and Sheriff Wilkins, driven by duty and desperation, was preparing to strike with the little leverage he possessed. Missouri's patience had ended. What had been rumor and suspicion was quickly becoming undeniable truth, and the Caldwell brothers were finding themselves trapped in the very fear they had cultivated. They had ruled through silence, but silence can only last so long. The cracks were spreading wide, and soon their world would collapse around them. By late September of 1892, the whispers about the Caldwell brothers had reached a fevered pitch. What had once been an undercurrent of rumor was now the main subject of every hushed conversation in town, every tense glance exchanged across church pews, every worried prayer muttered before bedtime. Neighbors no longer avoided the subject. They spoke of it openly, some with anger, others with dread, and all with the growing realization that the Caldwells' reign of fear could no longer continue unchecked. For Sheriff Thomas Wilkins, the moment he had waited for was finally at hand. The shallow graves discovered near the brothers' land had changed everything. No longer could he be accused of chasing phantoms or building suspicions on coincidence. There were bodies now, evidence of murder, though not definitive enough to haul William and Charles directly to trial. It was enough to justify action, to rally both his deputies and a town desperate for justice. And so, quietly, purposefully, the net began to tighten. Wilkins did not move recklessly. He knew that William was volatile, quick to violence, and backed by Charles's unwavering loyalty. A direct confrontation without preparation could end in bloodshed, his or his men's. Instead, he focused on surveillance and collection. The deputies spread out, watching the family's movements day and night. Notes were taken of their late-night errands, the wagons they rolled into the woods, the faint hammering of shovels that carried through quiet hours. Everything, even the smallest behavior, was documented. Yet the Caldwells were not fools. They sensed the eyes upon them. William was often seen patrolling the edges of their farmland, rifle in hand, as though daring anyone to cross. Charles, for his part, grew more withdrawn, his silence heavier, his nervous glances more pronounced. The farm, once loud with dogs and nighttime activity, began to quiet. But that quiet did not reassure the town, it unsettled them. A predator lurking in stillness is often more dangerous than one hunting in plain sight. Then came the moment when suspicion began to harden into certainty. A deputy, trailing the brothers one night at a distance, claimed to have seen them dragging a figure through the woods. Too far to intervene without risking his life, he kept his distance and returned at dawn with reinforcements. What they found was a fresh burial site, the soil still damp from disturbed earth. Though the body inside was mutilated beyond recognition, fragments of clothing identified it as belonging to the missing salesman whose wagon had been overturned weeks earlier. Word of this discovery spread like wildfire. The town was no longer paralyzed by fear. It was burning with outrage. Farmers who had once kept silent out of caution now pounded fists on the sheriff's desk, demanding immediate arrests. Mothers cried openly, afraid for their children every time the sun dipped below the horizon. Even the preacher, whose role had always been to urge calm and prayer, stood at his pulpit on Sunday and declared that evil was walking among them, and it had to be cast out. The Caldwell brothers could feel the walls closing in. William's arrogance, once so unchecked, began to show streaks of paranoia. He drank deeper at the tavern, but his laughter was thinner, forced, his eyes darting to every corner as though expecting chains at any moment. Charles fared worse. He aged visibly within weeks, his face hollow, his body rigid. Those who saw him in town noted how he rarely spoke and rarely looked anyone in the eye. There was something in his stare, they said, that seemed less like loyalty, now and more like the burden of secrets too heavy to carry. Sheriff Wilkins knew the time to hesitate had passed. Gathering a council of trusted deputies and a handful of determined townsmen, he prepared for what he believed would be the most dangerous confrontation of his career. The brothers, armed and cunning, would not be taken easily. But with the evidence building and the community pressing harder with each passing day, there was no choice. The Caldwells had to be stopped before more lives were claimed. The plan was simple but risky. Wilkins and his men would approach the farmstead at dawn, hoping to catch the brothers off guard and prevent them from slipping away into the woods. The element of daylight, he reasoned, might soften their defenses. No shadows to conceal their deeds, no darkness to grant them cover. And in broad view of the rising sun, perhaps even William Caldwell's arrogance would falter. The night before the raid, townsfolk barely slept. Some peeked from their windows in the direction of the Caldwell land, as though expecting to see smoke or hear the echo of gunfire. Others prayed quietly, anxious that the violence that had haunted them for months might spill openly into their streets come morning. There was no guarantee of what would happen, only the certainty that something had to. Meanwhile, within the farmhouse, the brothers felt the noose tightening. William paced the floorboards like a caged animal, muttering about betrayal, about weak men hiding behind the law. Charles sat silently at the table, his hands folded, his head lowered. He could hear the rage in his brother's voice, but behind it, something else lingered. Fear. For the first time, William's confidence seemed to fracture. He knew, even if he refused to say it aloud, that their days of hunting freely through Missouri were numbered. Dawn approached. Sheriff Wilkins prepared his men, each rifle checked, each set of instructions repeated. They tightened straps around their boots, glanced at one another with tense eyes, and rode out toward the Caldwell farm with the weight of the town's hopes riding silently upon them. The sun crested the horizon, painting the fields gold. The farm came into view, its outline stark against the morning sky. The dogs barked furiously as the riders drew nearer, and inside the house, William Caldwell reached for his rifle, his jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed. Charles rose slowly beside him, not with defiance but with a quiet resignation etched deep across his face. The confrontation that had been whispered about for months was no longer approaching in the distance. It was here. The net had tightened. There was no slipping free. The morning of reckoning had arrived. Sheriff Thomas Wilkins and his deputies rode steadily toward the Caldwell farm, their horses' hooves thudding against the hardened dirt as the sun rose behind them. The golden light of dawn could not soften the weight in their chests. Each man knew what awaited them might not be an arrest, but a battle, one the community had anticipated for months, and one that could easily end with blood spilled on Missouri soil. The Caldwell farmhouse came into focus, perched alone against the wide expanse of fields. The air brimmed with tension. Dogs barked wildly from behind crude fencing, their snarls echoing like warning bells. A lantern still burned faintly at the window, suggesting sleepless hours had kept the brothers pacing through the night. Wilkins raised his hand, signaling his men to halt just short of the property. Dust swirled around them as silence settled briefly, broken only by the dogs. The sheriff dismounted first, moving with the caution of a man who had anticipated this moment for far too long. He straightened his posture and called out across the distance, "William Caldwell, Charles Caldwell. By the authority of the law, I'm here to speak with you." "Step outside. For a moment, nothing." The farmhouse stood still, its weathered wood glowing faintly in the early light. Then, with the groan of old hinges, the front door swung open. William Caldwell stepped out first. His tall frame filled the doorway, a rifle slung casually over his shoulder, but his stance anything but casual. Behind him, Charles appeared, slower, quieter, his expression unreadable. The brothers stood side by side on the porch, two figures who looked less like farmers now, and more like sentinels guarding dark secrets. William's voice carried easily across the yard, sharp and mocking. "Well, Sheriff, you've brought quite the company. Come to share breakfast, or do you think you've finally got something worth drawing that badge for?" Wilkins didn't flinch. "We've got enough, William. Too many disappearances, too many graves near your land. This ends today. Put down the rifle and let's do this the right way." William barked a laugh, though it lacked the carelessness of his tavern swagger. "The right way? You mean your way. You think parading in here with a few scared men makes you the law? No. Out here we take what we need, and no weak-willed sheriff changes that." Beside him, Charles shifted but said nothing. His eyes, however, gave him away. Where William's burned with fury, Charles's were heavy with something different, conflict. His lips tightened, his gaze briefly dropping to the ground, as if the weight of their crimes was pulling at him harder than his brother's influence could hold. Wilkins saw it. He focused his words not solely on William, but on Charles. "Charles, you don't have to go down this road. Not today, not with him. You can make a choice." A flicker of hesitation crossed Charles's face, but William's fury snapped it away. He shoved his brother lightly at the shoulder. "Don't listen to him. He's just trying to divide us. We stand together, that's how we win. That's how we've always won." From behind Wilkins, one of the deputies muttered under his breath, his hand twitching near his rifle. The air was brittle, seconds away from shattering. Then it happened. In a flash, William raised his rifle to his shoulder. The crack of gunfire split the morning calm. The bullet whistled past Wilkins, striking the dirt inches from his feet. Horses reared, deputies shouted, and chaos erupted as rifles were unslung in rapid motion. The standoff had turned into open hostility. Wilkins dove for cover near a wagon wheel lying half-buried in the yard, barking commands to his men. Their return fire rang in sharp bursts, splinters flying from the porch columns where the brothers had taken position. The dogs went wild, thrashing against their chains, howling as though they could sense the violence unfolding. William fired recklessly, his voice a roar. "You'll never take us alive!" Each shot was an eruption of fury, less calculated than desperate. Yet even amidst the storm of bullets, Charles hesitated. He fired once, the shot going wide, almost intentional in its imprecision. Then he ducked behind cover, gripping his rifle but not raising it again. His eyes were wide, torn, caught between loyalty to the brother who had dominated his life and the growing realization of what continuing that loyalty meant. The gunfight stretched in pulses of sound and silence. Clouds of dust rose with each shot, stinging the eyes of the men below. Townsfolk, drawn by the noise, gathered cautiously at a distance, watching history unfold with pounding hearts. For months they had waited for this reckoning, and now here it was, violent, raw, inevitable. Finally, during a brief lull, Sheriff Wilkins called out again, his voice steel. "Charles, you don't have to follow him into the ground. This is your chance." Everyone's eyes darted to the younger Caldwell. His hands trembled on the wood of his rifle. William snarled at him, "Don't you dare! Don't you dare turn on me!" His words were not just an order. They were a plea wrapped in rage, and in that moment, something inside Charles broke. His rifle slipped from his hands, hitting the porch with a dull thud. For the first time, he raised his hands slowly into the air. The deputies froze, unsure if they were witnessing surrender or trickery. William's shout of betrayal ripped through the yard. "Coward! You worthless coward!" With fury blinding him, William rose from cover to fire again. But this time, without his brother's support, his recklessness sealed his fate. A deputy's bullet struck true, sending him sprawling backward onto the wooden planks of the porch. His rifle tumbled from his grip as blood spread quickly beneath him. The battle was over. A chilling silence fell across the farm. Only the panting of exhausted men and the distant crows broke the air. Charles remained frozen, hands raised, his expression one of hollow defeat. For years he had been bound by his brother's dominance, his crimes. Now in the space of minutes, that bond had ended in a pool of blood at his feet. Sheriff Wilkins ordered his deputies forward. They disarmed Charles, placing heavy iron cuffs around his wrists. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He only stared at William's body, eyes fixed as though searching for the brother he once followed so blindly, amid the lifeless remains left behind. The Caldwell reign of terror had finally broken. But in the aftermath, Missouri would be left to reckon not only with the scars of what the brothers had done, but with the more difficult question of how two sons of the soil had turned into the predators that haunted its fields, and that reckoning was just beginning. The gunfire had ceased, but its echoes lingered in the fields of Missouri long after William Caldwell's body cooled on his farmhouse porch. For months the community had lived under the shadow of two brothers, bound by blood and cruelty, their names whispered in fear. Now one lay dead and the other sat shackled, silent and broken. The nightmare was not over, but it had shifted. The reign of predators was ending, and the process of justice was beginning. Sheriff Thomas Wilkins oversaw the aftermath with a heavy heart. He was no stranger to violence, but confronting William Caldwell had carried a different weight. The sheriff could still feel the sting of soil where the bullet had nearly claimed his life. He could still see the look in Charles Caldwell's eyes, an expression not of rage but of hollow surrender. William had chosen defiance until his final breath, but Charles had let the rifle fall. That choice was the reason he was alive, and it would shape what came next. Word spread quickly. By midday, the town gathered near the sheriff's office, shock mixing with the relief of survival. Mothers clutched their children, farmers stood rigid with arms crossed, and whispers cut the air like blades. For many, satisfaction lay in the knowledge that William was gone, tamed at last by the iron bite of law and bullet. But Charles's fate would be more complicated. Some saw him as equally responsible, a willing accomplice who had hunted alongside his brother, carried out his orders, and shared the spoils of terror. Others, however, remembered Charles's silence. They recalled the nervous glances, the hesitations, the moments of uncertainty that suggested he was a captive of William's influence, chained to his brother's cruelty by a loyalty too blind to break. The debate raged in the streets, but in the eyes of the law, choice no longer belonged to the town. Charles Caldwell would stand trial. In the days that followed, the sheriff's office became a fortress. Deputies rotated in shifts, guarding Charles within its stone walls. He barely ate, barely spoke. When Wilkins pressed him with questions, he offered little in response. Sometimes only a slight nod, sometimes a whisper that drifted away before it could truly be heard. The younger Caldwell, for all his restraint during the final standoff, could not erase the dark weight of what he had been part of. Dozens of disappearances, families torn apart, bodies left in shallow graves. The people demanded clarity, and justice demanded confession. But confession did not come easily. The trial of Charles Caldwell began 2 weeks later, drawing crowds from miles around. The courthouse overflowed, its wooden benches filled with men and women who had been haunted by rumor for too long. Now they demanded to hear in full the story of what had happened along the roads that cut through their farmland. They demanded someone to look them in the eyes and admit to the horrors that had turned their world into a place of dread. The prosecution painted Charles as inseparable from his brother. Witnesses testified to having seen the two together at taverns on nights before disappearances. Merchants spoke of their sudden wealth, their brazen behavior. Deputies described the shallow graves found near their land and the tracks leading unmistakably toward their homestead. Piece by piece, the case wove a portrait of Charles not as a bystander, but as an active predator walking in William's shadow. The defense, however, sought to unearth a different truth. They argued Charles was never the leader, never the hand that guided their violence. Instead, they claimed, he was a victim of William's dominance, bound by fear, by loyalty, and by the crushing hold an elder brother could wield over a younger. They reminded the court of the moment he dropped his rifle, the moment he chose surrender instead of defiance, a choice William himself could not make. Perhaps, they argued, that moment revealed the man he had always been beneath the silence, a man bound but not fully corrupted. The courtroom hung in uneasy balance between these competing truths. Outside, the town remained restless. Families of the missing pressed for harsh judgment, weeping as they remembered the faces of those who would never return. Farmers muttered angrily that leniency was weakness, that any man who helped bury innocents deserved the same fate as the one who pulled the trigger. Yet others softened, recalling the hesitations they had seen, the way Charles often lingered behind William with reluctant steps. The community was divided, torn between justice and pity. For Sheriff Wilkins, the choice weighed sharply. He had seen Charles lower that weapon. He had seen the flicker of conflict etched into the young man's face. And though he could never excuse the role Charles had played, he could not forget the difference between him and the brother who had reveled in violence, who had defiantly spat on the law until his final moment. The jury deliberated for 2 long days. When they returned, the courthouse fell silent as the verdict was announced. Charles Caldwell was found guilty, not of premeditated murder, but of complicity, of partnership in crimes that had spread terror across Missouri. His life would not end on the gallows. Instead, he was sentenced to spend the rest of it behind iron bars, paying for the role he had played in the darkness that had consumed their lands. The decision did not satisfy everyone. Some left the courthouse furious, demanding that death was the only fair answer. Others left relieved, believing that Missouri had chosen not vengeance but restraint, proving that even after the horrors of the Caldwells, the community would not become the very thing it despised. When Charles was led from the courtroom, shackles rattling, he did not resist. He did not plead. He simply lowered his head, eyes fixed not on the jeering crowd but somewhere distant, perhaps lost in memories of his brother, of nights spent carrying out deeds he could never erase. For Missouri, justice had been delivered. Yet it arrived not with the satisfaction of triumph, but with the lingering ache of wounds too deep to heal. Families still mourned. Graves still marked the consequences of silence and fear. And for years to come, parents would warn their children of the roads where the Caldwell brothers once hunted, reminding them that evil does not always come from strangers. It can grow, quietly, from those who live beside us, those who eat at the same tables, those who carry the same names. The town could finally breathe again, but it would never forget. The Caldwell brothers were no longer free to roam the roads of Missouri. One lay buried in the soil he had once terrorized. The other sat behind thick iron bars, awaiting the long years of a life sentence. For the first time in months, the countryside was quiet, and yet that quiet did not feel like peace. It felt like the heavy silence left in the wake of a storm, a silence full of scars and memories that still haunted the people. In the weeks immediately following the trial, the town struggled to find its balance again. Farmers returned to their fields, children cautiously wandered back onto the roads, and church services became crowded with souls trying to reconcile faith with all that had been lost. But though life resumed, it did not resume as before. The wounds left by the Caldwell brothers were too raw, too deep. Families of the missing gathered often at the shallow graves that had been discovered, mourning not only the loved ones they lost, but those who were never found. Some graves remained unmarked, claimed only by personal effects, shoes, hair combs, torn bits of fabric that were all that remained of those who had vanished. Women wept openly. Men stood in rigid silence with jaws clenched so tightly that words refused to come. The sheriff himself carried the weight visibly. Thomas Wilkins was hailed as the man who had finally brought justice to Missouri, but there was no celebration in him. He had seen too closely the faces of the victims, the fear that had split the town in two, and the emptiness left behind. At night, when the fields were quiet and the sky stretched endlessly overhead, Wilkins often sat alone on his porch, replaying that dawn confrontation over and over, the thunder of gunfire, William's roar of defiance, Charles lowering his rifle. He knew justice had been done, but the cost of it, lives destroyed, trust shattered, remained. The town, too, carried that cost. For generations, Missouri farmers had prided themselves on open doors and unshaken trust. Travelers were welcomed, neighbors leaned on each other, and suspicion was an uncommon shadow. But after the Caldwells, all of that changed. Doors that had once stood unlocked were now bolted at night. Travelers no longer found warm welcomes, but narrowed eyes and guarded hospitality. The community had learned a brutal lesson, that cruelty could grow from within, disguised as kin, disguised as neighbor. And once learned, such lessons are never forgotten. Yet even amid grief, stories began to spread. Journalists from neighboring states arrived in town, scribbling in notebooks, eager to take the tale of the Caldwell brothers beyond Missouri. They printed grim headlines about the brothers who hunted together and Missouri's summer of fear. Their words passed from one state to the next, and before long, the Caldwells had become notorious far beyond the countryside that birthed them. Some accounts sensationalized the truth, weaving their crimes into exaggerated myths of outlaw cruelty. Others were more sober, focusing on the failure of silence, how neighbors' fears kept them from speaking sooner, how hesitation allowed the brothers' crimes to multiply. Whatever the telling, one thing was certain. The Caldwell name became synonymous with terror, an uneasy warning whispered into the ears of children to keep them from wandering too far after dark. Inside the prison walls, Charles Caldwell lived with a silence heavier than any chain. Guards described him as quiet, obedient and reserved, never raising his voice, never lashing out. Some saw this as an admission of guilt, others as a man crushed beneath his own regret. When questioned about his brother, he rarely answered. But once, when pressed by a guard, he whispered the same words again and again. He said we'd always stand together. Years later, historians would debate what truly drove Charles Caldwell. Was he as dangerous as William, the mastermind's obedient partner in brutality? Or was he merely a shadow, a broken young man ensnared by his older brother's will, too afraid or too bound by loyalty to break away? The records were not clear, and in that uncertainty, the story of the younger Caldwell gained its own grim fascination. For the families, however, such questions offered no comfort. Whether leader or follower, William or Charles, the truth remained. Dozens of innocent lives were gone, their futures stolen by the brothers' choices. And no trial, no prison sentence, no execution could restore them. The fields of Missouri would always carry their ghosts, their memories lingering among the crops, the woods, and the paths where footsteps abruptly ended. Still, the town endured. Slowly, resilience grew from grief. Farmers learned to trust again, though in measured doses. Children learned to laugh again, though always under watchful eyes. And as the seasons turned, life's rhythm began to mend. Though the memory of 1892 remained etched in the collective heart, what the Caldwell brothers left behind was more than blood. It was a story that reshaped how a community saw itself, how it understood the bond between trust and fear, silence and complicity. For Missouri, it was a reminder that evil does not always thunder in through the hills. Sometimes it grows quietly in the fields right beside you, until the silence around it begins to break. And when that silence finally broke, the scars that followed would never fade. By the autumn of 1892, Missouri was no longer simply a farming state in the eyes of the nation. Newspapers across the country now carried its name alongside chilling headlines, articles that painted the Caldwells as a symbol of rural brutality, brothers who had turned open farmland into a theater of blood. For decades to come, Missouri would not simply be remembered for its crops or its river towns, but for the tale of two siblings who hunted together. The story spread quickly. From St. Louis to Chicago, from Kansas City to New York, journalists pieced together the details: the missing travelers, the shallow graves, the dawn standoff that ended with William dead and Charles in chains. Some papers sensationalized the accounts, calling William Missouri's blood farmer. Others coined darker titles such as the Butcher Brothers. Illustrations, often grotesque and exaggerated, depicted shadowy men with rifles, lanterns glowing over freshly dug graves. These artistic renderings were printed faster than the real investigation could confirm its facts, turning the Caldwells into both reality and legend. But beyond lurid headlines, the story carried implications that weighed heavily on Missouri itself. Neighboring communities feared being painted with the same brush, their peaceful lands mistaken for places of barbarity. Preachers worried that the notoriety would stain the state's soul, that outsiders would think only of cruelty rather than faith and family. And yet, try as they might to bury the story, it was no use. The Caldwells had ensured their names would outlive them. For Missouri's small towns, the reputation carried mixed consequences. On the one hand, travelers became wary of its backroads, suspicious of the lonely farmhouses dotting its wide fields. Hospitality, once a mark of pride, faltered as suspicion took root. On the other hand, curiosity began to draw outsiders in. Journalists, historians, even thrill-seekers, hoping to catch a glimpse of the farmhouse where William Caldwell met his fate. Locals, torn between frustration and necessity, sometimes found themselves guiding strangers through their lands, reliving horrors for the sake of payment or recognition. Inside the prison, Charles Caldwell unwillingly became a symbol of that notoriety. Reporters badgered Sheriff Wilkins, begging for access to him, eager to print the first directly spoken words from the surviving brother. Some offered money for letters, others concocted stories without ever meeting him. But Charles rarely spoke in confinement, his silence deepening with each passing week. When approached by officials, he gave no dramatic confessions, no grand explanations. He remained the quieter shadow of his brother, the man who had lowered his rifle, but too late to make himself innocent. One prison chaplain claimed that Charles broke silence only once in his presence, when prompted to reflect on his crimes. Quietly, almost inaudibly, Charles is said to have responded, "I thought standing by him meant staying alive, but all it did was kill me slower." Whether those words were reported accurately or embellished by the chaplain himself remains uncertain. Still, they circulated widely in the press, appearing in headline after headline, as though they were confession and epitaph alike. The image of a younger brother trapped in loyalty to an older one became a powerful narrative, debated by moralists, journalists, and lawmakers alike. Was Charles equally wicked, or a tragic figure broken by influence? The nation could not agree. In the towns of Missouri, however, the debate mattered little. For the families of the missing, Charles's silence was proof enough of guilt. Parents wept not for psychology, but for daughters and sons whose faces would never return at the supper table. Fathers spoke in anger, not about influence but about graves dug in secrecy. For them there was no debate, there was only loss. The impact of the case reached even further. Lawmakers across the Midwest began pressing for stronger rural patrols, tighter systems of justice in isolated farming communities where suspicion might otherwise linger too long. The Caldwell brothers highlighted a truth that many no longer dared to ignore. Isolation could breed danger just as easily as it nurtured family. Communities learned to pay more attention to the signs they once dismissed as simple strangeness: the late-night movements, the missing livestock, the strange smell of freshly turned soil. Missouri's people carried the burden of reputation, but they also carried with them a hardened vigilance. Never again, they swore to one another, would silence allow cruelty to grow unchecked in the shadows of their farmland. And yet, despite these vows, the story of the Caldwell brothers lived on in ways few predicted. In the years after the trial, their names became a cautionary tale told at bonfires, a whispered warning passed to children. Do not wander the roads at night, for the Caldwells may be waiting. Though one was dead and the other imprisoned, their legend grew larger than their lives. Some townsfolk detested the story's survival, arguing that it kept wounds open that should be healed. Others embraced it as history, a stark reminder of what fear had cost them, ensuring the community never again fell asleep under the comfort of silence. By the close of 1892, Missouri's reputation was forever altered. It was no longer the quiet farmland it had been in the eyes of the outside world. Now it was a place that bore the scars of a family turned into predators, a land whose innocence had been broken, but whose resilience endured. For Charles Caldwell, history had chosen his role for him, not merely as William's brother, but as the surviving witness to the nightmare. And for Missouri, his story had become not just a tale of a crime, but a chapter in its identity, one that would travel beyond state lines, carried in papers, sermons, and the hushed stories told from one generation to the next. For Charles Caldwell, the trial had marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. Gone were the open fields, the echoing woods and the farmhouse that had once stood as the stage for so many of his brother's cruelties. In their place came cold stone walls, barred windows, and the unrelenting clank of iron as cell doors shut with finality. His new world was measured not in acres of farmland, but in the slow drag of years, in the monotonous routine of prison life. From the first day he stepped inside, Charles became an object of morbid fascination. Guards and inmates alike knew his name before he arrived. To some he was a killer in his own right, deserving no pity. To others, he was the weaker half of a duo, a man who had followed rather than led, cursed by loyalty more than cruelty. Whatever the perspective, one truth remained constant. Charles Caldwell could not escape being the surviving brother. The prison yard became his stage. Men watched him carefully, curious to see if the youngest Caldwell carried the same violence his brother had embodied. At first, Charles remained cautious, quiet. He kept to himself, avoiding confrontation and rarely speaking unless directly addressed. Yet as weeks turned into months, patterns began to form. He labored without complaint, rose when ordered, and fell into silence each night without causing trouble. Violence, it seemed, had left him, if it had ever truly been his nature at all. Still, whispers followed him. At meals, inmates sometimes muttered cruel jokes, "Careful, or the Caldwell'll dig you a shallow grave." Others mocked his silence, daring him to reveal what he and William had truly done in those fields. But Charles offered nothing. He never defended himself, never struck back, never tried to explain. His silence became infamous, leaving the guilty and the innocent alike to fill the void with their own imaginations. In a way, he allowed the myth of the Caldwells to grow even larger. Year after year, Charles aged under that silence. Prison records noted him as a model inmate, neither rebellious nor troublesome. Chaplains marked him as contemplative, perhaps genuinely repentant. One described him as a man aching beneath the weight of memory, who speaks little but carries the burden of seeing too much. For the outside world, those glimpses only deepened the mystery. Was Charles haunted by his brother's acts or his own? Meanwhile, Missouri did not forget him. Each year, on the anniversary of the brothers' downfall, newspapers revisited the tale. William was always cast as the monster, the ringleader, the embodiment of cruelty. But Charles sat in the grey middle, sometimes portrayed as complicit, sometimes as a prisoner of loyalty, and sometimes as a warning about the power of silence. His life sentence meant he continued to serve as a living reminder of the town's darkest chapter. As decades passed, fewer and fewer people remembered the events firsthand. Children who had once been kept inside at night grew old, their own grandchildren hearing the story secondhand at firesides. With time, William Caldwell became legend, a brutal figure whose name was invoked like a curse. Charles remained quite literally a prisoner of history, alive but overshadowed by the myth of his brother. Inside the prison, he grew frail. His hair thinned, his back bent with years of labor. Still, he carried himself with the same heavy silence that had defined him since the day of his capture. Guards came and went. Generations of inmates rose and fell, but Charles Caldwell remained unchanged in his quiet endurance. On rare occasions, writers and reporters sought interviews with him. Some were granted, though they yielded little. His words were short, clipped, often evasive. When asked about William, his answer was always the same. He was my brother. No comment on guilt, no defense, no anger, just the weight of family and a sentence that carried all the complexity he refused to unpack. And yet even that silence spoke volumes. To many it suggested that Charles was haunted not by the law, but by the bond he could never fully break. He had turned against William in those final moments at the farmhouse, dropping the rifle instead of joining his brother's last stand. But that act, however decisive, had not freed him from the ghost of William Caldwell. If anything, it had bound him tighter, leaving him to carry memories William never had to face. Within Missouri, the community had long since moved on to new challenges, new histories. But the story of the Caldwell brothers remained carved deeply in its cultural memory. The farmhouse where William died eventually rotted and collapsed, until only its foundation and whispers remained. The woods where graves were found grew thick again, swallowing old scars beneath layers of earth and leaves. But the story itself endured. In every retelling, Charles was cast differently, sometimes villain, sometimes victim, and sometimes both. For Charles himself, there was no rewriting. His days were measured in repetition until, finally, they dwindled into his last. He died quietly, decades after the crimes that had stained his name. The prison chaplain recorded him as calm, resigned, a man who left no final words. He passed as he had lived in those final years, silent. When news of his death spread, papers across the Midwest ran headlines once more. "The last Caldwell gone," one read, "a chapter of Missouri's darkest past closes." Yet even in death there was no clear consensus on his legacy. Some obituaries condemned him outright, branding him a murderer deserving no pity. Others offered nuance, framing him as a tragic figure forever caught in his brother's shadow. But for Missouri, the matter was simpler. With Charles Caldwell gone, the story had finally ended. Still, the scars remained. The town still bore the memory of vanished travelers, of shallow graves uncovered by accident, of nights filled with whispers and fear. The Caldwells were history now, but history has a way of clinging, refusing to be forgotten. To this day, their story lingers, a reminder of the fragile line between trust and terror, brotherhood and betrayal. William Caldwell had been the fire, blazing and destructive until extinguished. Charles Caldwell had been the shadow lingering long after, a quieter but equally haunting presence. Together, they left Missouri not only with wounds but with a warning. That evil can take root in the most familiar soil, and once it grows, it does not die easily. The Caldwell brothers were gone. William lay in the soil of Missouri, felled by a deputy's bullet and remembered as one of the state's most brutal predators. Charles, the quieter shadow, spent the last decades of his life behind bars until death finally claimed him too. Their crimes, shocking as they were, had ended long ago. Yet long after their bodies had been lowered into the earth, their presence lingered in the memory of the land. For Missouri, the year 1892 became a dividing line, before the Caldwells and after them. Life did not simply return to what it had been. The scars of fear ran too deep, reshaping the ways neighbors trusted, the ways parents warned their children, the ways strangers were greeted on lonely roads. Innocence, once so natural in farming towns, was gone. In its place remained vigilance, a wariness born of remembering the price of silence. Generations passed, and with them, the freshness of the Caldwell reign faded into history. The farmhouse where William made his last stand collapsed with time, swallowed by weeds and weather, until only whispers pointed to where it once stood. The woods where graves had been discovered grew thick again, erasing scars beneath decades of growth. Yet even as the physical remains disappeared, the story did not. It carried on in newspapers, in sermons, in old voices passing warnings into the ears of grandchildren. The brothers' legacy became both cautionary tale and local folklore. Parents, seeking to keep children close at night, invoked their names, "Don't wander too far," or "The Caldwells will get you." Around campfires, the story gained even darker layers, dramatized by those who retold it for effect. In this way, William and Charles became more than men. They became symbols, one of unchecked cruelty, the other of silence and broken loyalty. Historians debated for years which truth mattered most. Was the tragedy of Missouri in William's violence, or in Charles's silence? Was Charles as guilty as his brother, or was he a victim of William's dominance, dragged into sins he could not escape? The debates yielded no single answer, but perhaps that uncertainty carried the true weight of the story, forcing each generation to confront difficult questions about guilt, loyalty, and choice. Sheriff Thomas Wilkins did not live long after the trial to see how their story grew larger than life, but for those who remembered him, his name remained tied forever to the end of the Caldwell terror. He was the man who had faced them at dawn, the man who had brought Missouri back from the edge of lawlessness. And yet, even he admitted to friends in his final days that the victory carried little joy. Justice was done, he was said to remark, but justice does not fix what was already broken. In that statement lay the truest legacy of the Caldwell case. Justice had been delivered. William was gone. Charles imprisoned, but the families of the missing still mourned. The community still bore scars, and the state still carried a reputation darkened by blood. Justice may have ended the crimes, but it could never undo them. As decades rolled into the new century, Missouri continued to change. Industries grew, railroads stretched farther, towns modernized. Yet in quiet corners, in fading photographs, and in brittle clippings yellowed with age, the Caldwell brothers remained. Their names surfaced when neighbors reminisced about hard years, when teachers spoke of caution, when preachers warned of sin left unchecked. They were gone, but they had etched themselves into the marrow of Missouri's story. By then, both were no longer men. They had become representations. William, the embodiment of human cruelty untethered, a reminder of how arrogance and violence can consume not only the guilty, but all who live in fear of them. Charles, the symbol of what silence can cost. A man who might have chosen differently but chose too late. A man chained less by iron than by family loyalty that became his curse. Together their tale carried one enduring warning, that evil need not wear masks or come from distant strangers. Sometimes it grows in the same household, hidden behind familiarity until it is too late to stop. That warning outlived them, and in a way that was their true legacy. To this day, there are still those who tell the story of the Caldwell brothers in Missouri. Some tell it as history, grounded in fact and detail. Others tell it as legend, clouded by exaggeration but sharpened by caution. Either way, it remains alive, not as celebration but as remembrance, because the moment a community forgets the cost of such silence, it risks repeating it. The Caldwell brothers hunted together, and in doing so, they scarred the land beyond their lifespans. They left behind graves, grief, and a lesson written not in ink, but in the blood of neighbors and strangers alike. The lesson is simple, yet it echoes endlessly. When violence rises, silence becomes its accomplice, and so their story remains, not merely a tale of two men, but a living scar carved into the soil of Missouri. A reminder passed from voice to voice that even amid the quiet of farmland, even behind familiar doors, darkness can dwell. And once it does, it leaves behind shadows that time cannot erase. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.